Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 22 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I believe each of these episodes stands on its own, but if you're the sort of person who likes to have the full context of a story, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last time, on the History Sphere, I talked about the leadership style of Leonid Brezhnev and the early effects of economic stagnation in the USSR in the late 1960s and 1970s. This week, I will talk about the 1968 Prague Spring and the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine. This is The End of History, Part 22. In case anyone has been living under a rock or has given in to the pull of nihilistic apathy that I have so often been tempted by myself, the United States, my home country, where I live, work, and raise my family, and record this podcast, is in the midst of a presidential election. Those who have followed U.S. politics for a long time, like I have, will be familiar with the common refrain that we hear every 4 years, that this is the most important election of our lifetime. Unfortunately, I think for the last few election cycles, this has actually been true. I'm reminded of an episode of The Simpsons where Bart expresses to Homer that this is the worst day of his life, and Homer replies, "The worst day of your life so far." That's what I believe is going on with American presidential elections. With every presidency, more and more power is accumulated by the executive branch of the US government, that is, the presidency. And as recent precedent from the Supreme Court simultaneously vested more power in the presidency while shielding the person of the president from accountability, it's more important than it ever has been who that person is. And if the trend continues 4 years from now, it will be even more important. I know a good chunk of my listeners are outside the United States, and I appreciate all of you. Unfortunately, because of the United States' status as a superpower and center of world finance, the outcome of our elections affect you too, even though you have no influence over the outcome. Sorry about that. To be fair, I don't have a whole lot of influence over the outcome either because I don't live in a swing state. But I think the Electoral College is a discussion for another day. One very important way in which the outcome of this election will affect other countries is the posture of the future president towards NATO and other foreign military alliances. One candidate, Donald Trump, has been highly critical of the U.S. role in these alliances, complaining that the United States does not receive enough return on our investment in the mutual defense of America's allies around the world. The other presumptive candidate has recently been replaced, but if Kamala Harris's position mirrors that of Joe Biden, she's likely to be a much more traditional defender of America's role as a hegemonic global superpower and the sword and shield of global liberal democracy. In my opinion, both of these positions are deeply flawed. I do think one is more flawed than the other, but as this is not a show about American politics or my views of American politics, I'm going to keep you guessing. There's been some speculation among pundits here in America that if Trump is elected, the United States might even try to leave NATO. It's probably unlikely that this would actually happen, but it's remarkable that we're even having the conversation, as such a move would have been unthinkable a mere decade ago. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is probably the most important military alliance that the United States belongs to. It's based on mutual defense by its member states. Its most important provision states that an attack on one member will be treated as an attack on all members and trigger a collective military response. This article has only been invoked once in the organization's history in response to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attack on the United States. The original intent behind NATO was to serve as an alliance of the Western liberal democracies against encroachment by the Soviet Union and its communist allies. In response, the Soviets formed their own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact functioned similar to NATO, as a collective defense treaty between communist countries that would all fight together if the Cold War became hot. Its members included the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Albania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. NATO during the Cold War held together rather easily. Its European members, in close proximity to the Warsaw Pact nations, understood the strategic necessity of the alliance, and its being questioned in North America is a very recent phenomenon. By contrast, the Soviet Union took action more than once to hold the Warsaw Pact together by force. I've already talked about one of those instances in this podcast, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution and its crushing by Soviet forces under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. It was not until the Brezhnev era, however, in 1968 to be specific, that holding together the alliance by force would become an official tenet of Soviet foreign policy, a policy that came to be known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. When the history of the Cold War is told from a Western perspective, this use of force is often portrayed as evidence of the moral superiority of the Western democracies over communism. The reality, as usual, is more complicated. If Italy, for instance, which always had a strong communist movement within its borders, had elected a socialist government and begun to move away from NATO and closer to the Warsaw Pact, do any of us really think for a second that the United States would have let that happen? Outside of Europe, the US used force all the time to prevent what they perceived as movement towards communism or alliance with the Soviets. They overthrew the government of Iran, staged coups throughout Latin America, and fought a decade-plus-long war in Vietnam to prevent countries from turning red. And the US-backed governments in many of these countries were, to put it mildly, less than democratic. The Cold War was a time fraught with hypocrisy and moral ambiguity by both sides. For the Soviets, however, the need to hold their alliance together by force had much more far-reaching consequences than it did for the United States. It created a much more apparent gap between their stated values of anti-imperialism and the imperialist reality that held together the communist world. Soviet propaganda tried its best to put lipstick on this particular pig, but the inconsistency was obvious to all but the most fanatical and sycophantic communists. The time and place where the mask would begin to unravel was 1968 in Czechoslovakia. What happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968 is, in many ways, similar to what happened in Hungary in 1956. Like the uprising in Hungary 12 years earlier, the roots of the events that came to be known as the Prague Spring are traceable to de-Stalinization and the promise of reform and a more open society. Czechoslovakia was one of many nations that emerged from the fracturing of the old Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire. In contrast to Hungary, Czechoslovakia did not really experience any kind of revolutionary upheaval following independence, save some nationalist unrest in the regions of the country populated by ethnic Germans and Hungarians. With few exceptions, however, Czechoslovakia enjoyed a period of calm and stability in the interwar years, and was therefore able to establish itself as a stable, multi-party democracy, something the other states of Central and Eastern Europe mostly failed to do during the same period. As a functioning democracy, the government of Czechoslovakia was alarmed by the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly as Hitler and the Nazis came to power in Germany and proclaimed themselves the protectors of the German minority within Czechoslovakia. They looked to the other democracies of Europe, particularly France and the UK, to protect them from feared German aggression. Instead, in 1938, in Munich, the British and French did the other thing. They signed away Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, the territory along the border with Germany occupied by a majority of ethnic Germans, to Nazi Germany, in exchange for a promise from Hitler that he had no more territorial demands in Europe. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the Munich conference, and they took no part in the discussions. Stripped of the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia no longer had defensible borders, and in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise. The German Wehrmacht marched in and occupied the rest of the country, beginning a brutal 6-year occupation by Nazi Germany. The Slovak part of the country would be allowed by the Germans to form a pro-Nazi Slovak puppet state, while the Czech part of the country was completely swallowed up and dominated by the Nazis. Post-war, due to its geographic location and pursuant to agreements made by the Allies at the Yalta Conference, see episode 10 for more on the Yalta Conference, Czechoslovakia found itself firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. Like in Hungary, Poland, and other states in the Soviet sphere of influence, however, Stalin did not immediately impose a communist government by force. He allowed elections to take place, hoping that the communists would win and negate the necessity for the use of force, the bad optics of which even Stalin understood. National elections were held in May 1946, and in contrast to the Hungarian post-war elections, which I talked about back in episode 15, in Czechoslovakia, the communists actually did quite well. The Soviets were not as unpopular in Czechoslovakia as they were in Hungary or Poland. Betrayed by the Western democracies in 1938, many Czechs embraced the Soviets as liberators and were receptive to their ideology. In the 1946 election, the Communists won a plurality of the vote, with around 40% in the Czech majority regions of the country, but were trounced by the center-left Democratic Party, who received an outright majority of the vote, a whopping 60%, in the Slovak majority regions. The Communists eventually established a coalition government alongside the Social Democrats and the Czechoslovak National Socialist Party, which, despite its similar name, had nothing to do with the Nazis and was actually a center-left pro-democracy party. The Communists, having received the most votes and enjoying the backing of the Red Army, filled most of the important government posts. Frustratingly for the Communists, however, when a presidential election was held the following month, the pre-war president who had presided over the government in exile during the war, Edvard Beneš, a left-of-center moderate, was elected as president, leaving the power of state and the power of government divided. After 2 years of communist government, by 1948, a majority of people were fed up with it, and polling suggested that the communists would be defeated in the next election. Rather than waiting for this to unfold, the communists sprang to action, using their positions in government to extra-legally purge the national police force of non-communists. They then staged demonstrations to seize and occupy the offices of non-communist government ministers and force their resignations. President Beneš at first refused to accept the resignation of non-communist ministers, coerced as it was. But as pressure mounted from armed communist militias taking to the streets, he eventually relented and allowed the communist prime minister, Klement Gottwald, to form a communist-dominated government. When that communist government drafted and enacted a new constitution that, while not explicitly communist, was modeled on that of the USSR, Beneš resigned rather than participate in the farce. From this time, it's fair to categorize Czechoslovakia as a fully Marxist-Leninist communist state. Czechoslovakia transitioned relatively quickly into hardcore Stalinism, and all of the things that came with that. Purges, suppression of the opposition, show trials, collectivization of agriculture, nationalization of all industry, etc. Under the leadership of Gottwald, Czechoslovakia became one of the most repressive states in the Soviet bloc, which is really saying something. When Gottwald died in March 1953, only a few days after Stalin, it seemed that Czechoslovakia, like the USSR, might have a pathway away from Stalinism. But unlike in the USSR, where the reformer Khrushchev rose to power and opened up the country somewhat, the opposite took place in Czechoslovakia. A hardline Stalinist, Antonín Novotný, outmaneuvered his political rivals and assumed leadership of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. As a result, the thaw that took place in the USSR and other Soviet bloc states didn't really happen in Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovakian communists still took their marching orders from Moscow, so while Khrushchev was in charge, Novotny was forced to enact some limited reforms. But these reforms were slower and more limited than in countries like Hungary and Poland, as Novotny and his deputies dragged their feet and sought to maintain the Stalinist model. The rehabilitation of victims of the Stalinist show trials did not take place, for instance, until 1967. By late 1967, the pro-reform members of the party Central Committee, led by the head of the Slovakian Communist Party, Alexander Dubček, had garnered enough support to openly challenge Novotny. In December, Novotny invited Brezhnev to Prague to ask for his assistance in maintaining his position, to which Brezhnev replied, quote, "This is your affair," end quote. It's not entirely clear why Brezhnev withdrew his support for Novotny at this critical juncture. The obvious path forward, especially for a man like Brezhnev who liked to ride the status quo and take the middle ground, was to stick with the devil he knew. That said, there are a few rational reasons why Brezhnev may have chosen to abandon Novotny. First and foremost was that, though he was an anti-reform hardliner, he had spoken out against the removal of Khrushchev from power back in 1964, something that for obvious reasons did not sit well with Brezhnev. There was also concern that the lack of de-Stalinization in Czechoslovakia was to blame for the sluggish economy. That is, the highly centralized nature of the government was preventing growth. Above all, it seemed that Brezhnev enjoyed a warm personal relationship with Novotny's challenger, Dubček. Alexander Dubček at first glance appeared to be an ideal choice from Moscow's perspective. He was popular and came without the Stalinist baggage that Novotny had, but the Politburo in Moscow also seemed confident that he would be their creature. After all, he had grown up in the Soviet Union. Though he was born in Slovakia in 1921, as a baby, he moved with his idealistic leftist parents to the Soviet Union, and he grew up in a commune in what's now Kyrgyzstan, near the city of Bishkek. In 1938, when he was 17, Stalin promulgated a law that foreigners residing in the USSR must renounce their foreign citizenship in favor of Soviet citizenship. Rather than renounce citizenship in their homeland, the Dubčeks returned to Czechoslovakia, just in time to see it overrun and occupied by Nazi Germany. The young Alexander joined the illegal Slovak Communist Party and was recruited to join a partisan brigade, actively resisting the occupiers and their collaborators in the puppet Slovak government. He and his brother both participated in the Slovak National Uprising of 1944. His brother was killed in that uprising. After the war, Dubček continued to rise through the ranks of the Communist Party, and in 1955, the party sent him back to the Soviet Union to study political science in Moscow. He was in Moscow when, in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev gave his secret speech, denouncing Stalin and Stalinism, and calling for the Communist Party to return to its true democratic roots. The secret speech triggered a renaissance among the Soviet intelligentsia. Especially on university campuses, people were embracing reform and debating political issues with an openness that had not been seen in the USSR since the early days of the revolution. Dubček was there. He saw it all, experienced it, took part in it, and like many young people at the time, he was inspired by it. It's worth mentioning that there were two other university students in Moscow, a few years younger than Dubček, who were equally inspired by Khrushchev's secret speech and the political and intellectual renaissance it sparked. Zdeněk Mlynar, a young Czech law student who would become one of Dubček's closest advisors, and his close friend and classmate, Mikhail Gorbachev, who will play a major role in this podcast pretty soon. It's likely that Dubček's future philosophy of socialism with a human face first began to take root during his time in Moscow. In 1958, he returned to Czechoslovakia and slowly began advancing in the party apparatus, holding various positions in the Slovak Communist Party and the National Czechoslovak Communist Party until, in 1963, he led a movement to oust the Stalinist allies of Novotny from the head of the Slovak Communist Party and replace them. During Dubček's role as head of the Slovak Party, he led the way in implementing de-Stalinization reforms, including rehabilitating victims of prior political persecution and reviving the legacy of pre-communist Slovak national heroes in the public consciousness. Though he was a reformer and an anti-Stalinist, he had to move cautiously. the Slovak Communist Party remained firmly subordinate to the Czechoslovak Communist Party, and he remained firmly subject to the whims of Novotny. Nonetheless, even with the very cautious reforms, the Slovak lands within Czechoslovakia earned a reputation for being generally freer and more open than the Czech lands during the mid-1960s under Dubček's leadership. When Dubček began maneuvering against Novotny in late 1967, he was already on the radar of Brezhnev and the Soviets. Brezhnev could see he was a reformer, but it's unlikely he understood how far Dubček wanted to take things. As I talked about in the previous episode, Brezhnev was not prone to extreme positions in any direction. He was not against reform per se. He could see as well as anyone that Novotny's hardline Stalinist tendencies were stifling economic growth, and he probably wanted a reformer to step in and catch Czechoslovakia up to the other Eastern Bloc countries, but no further than that. It seems he thought Dubček was the man for this job. Because he had lived nearly half his life in the Soviet Union, Brezhnev was confident that Dubček would be his man in Prague, a reformer but not a revolutionary, who would do as Moscow told him. But Brezhnev misread his man. With the backing of Moscow, Dubček and his allies pushed Novotny out and seized control of the Czechoslovak Communist Party on January 5, 1968. The reforms were slow at first, the kind of reforms Moscow expected and was okay with. Rehabilitating victims of political purges, a loosening of press censorship when it came to criticizing his predecessor, etc. All the kinds of things that went hand in hand with the process of de-Stalinization. Then, in April, the Soviets began to really take notice and become concerned when Dubček announced his new program of socialism with a human face. This program looked to the Soviets suspiciously like Western bourgeois liberal democracy. The official proclamation from the Czechoslovak Politburo stated, quote, "The implementation of constitutional freedoms of assembly and also association must be ensured this year, so that the possibility of setting up voluntary organizations, special interest associations, societies, etc. is guaranteed by law to meet the actual interests and needs of various strata and categories of our citizens, without bureaucratic interference and without monopoly of any individual organization." End quote. The party justified this policy shift stating, quote, "Socialism cannot mean only liberation of the working people from the domination of exploiting class relations, but must make more provisions for a fuller life of the personality than any bourgeois democracy." End quote. These were not mere words meant to placate liberal reformers in the party. Dubček meant them. Censorship was first loosened and then abolished entirely. Czechoslovakia became the first Eastern Bloc nation with a fully free press and guaranteed free speech rights in practice, not just on paper. Though the central role of the Communist Party was emphasized and, for the time being, opposition political parties were not legalized, the program guaranteed freedom of association, and people began to form quote-unquote clubs where they discussed and debated politics, coalescing into societies that began to look suspiciously like political parties. Dubček did not stop with individual liberties either. Next, he sought to liberalize the economy. He and his advisors understood too well the problems with planned economics that I talked about in last week's episode, mainly that the consumer economy especially cannot be effectively centrally planned like heavy industry. Phenomena like inflation and disruptions in supply chains were simply too complex to accurately predict and plan for. Even if they could plan their own national economy, it was impossible to isolate the consumer market from fluctuations in the global market. Thus, Dubček also sought to liberalize the economy. He shifted the focus of the economic planners to developing the consumer sector, and announced plans for market-based reforms that would lead to a kind of mixed economy. Brezhnev, who had been given similar advice by his own economists, but ignored it in favor of maintaining a highly centralized, planned economy focusing on heavy industry, was horrified. We don't know his inner thoughts on the matter, but I'm inclined to believe that Brezhnev not only disagreed with the liberalization of the Czechoslovak economy, but he was worried about being proven wrong. not just because he was extremely egotistical, though he certainly was, but because if successful, these reforms would undermine his own position, and perhaps the entire socialist system. He simply couldn't allow it. Even then, however, as Soviet diplomats began to signal concern and disapproval of the reforms, Dubček pressed on. The straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was likely when Dubček announced freedom of movement, that is, allowing Czechoslovakians to freely travel abroad and allowing foreigners, including tourists from the capitalist West, to freely travel in Czechoslovakia. And he also announced that Czechoslovakia would pursue better relations with Western nations and continue close cooperation with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, acting as a bridge between the communist and capitalist world. To the Soviets, this sounded suspiciously like neutrality, that is, an intent to break away from the Warsaw Pact. Those of you who listened to episode 15 will likely remember that the last straw for Khrushchev in 1956 was when Imre Nagy announced Hungary's intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. Dubček was well aware of what had taken place in Hungary 12 years before, and he was careful to emphasize that Czechoslovakia would remain in the Warsaw Pact. But much like American Southerners saw the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 as the first step towards abolishing slavery, despite his clear statements to the contrary, in 1968, Leonid Brezhnev and the Soviet Politburo saw socialism with a human face and the cultural renaissance that it brought, remembered today as the Prague Spring, as the first step on a slippery slope toward anti-communist counter-revolution. Brezhnev was determined to nip it in the bud. He was given his pretext in July when he received entreaties from hardliners in the Czechoslovak Communist Party begging him to step in and put a stop to Dubček's reforms. At the time, the names of the Czechoslovak communists who pleaded for help were never specified, and it was assumed by many for decades that these pleas to the Soviets for intervention had been invented whole cloth as a mere pretext for invasion. More recent scholarship, undertaken after the wider world was given access to the Soviet archives in the 1990s and early 2000s, suggests that these entreaties were actually real. Even as Dubček met with the Soviet Politburo, including Brezhnev, in the Slovak border town of Čierna, near the modern border of Slovakia and Ukraine, to hammer out a diplomatic compromise, plans were already in the works for a military invasion of Czechoslovakia. On August 21, 1968, troops from the Soviet Union and 3 other Warsaw Pact countries, including Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria, crossed the border into Czechoslovakia. East Germany was also fully supportive of the invasion, but because of the relatively recent history of German invasion in the Second World War, it was decided at the last minute that, for reasons of optics, no German troops would take part in the invasion. The invasion was over relatively quickly. Dubček knew that his small country stood no chance against the armed might of the Soviet Union, and immediately upon hearing the news of the invasion, addressed his people and ordered them not to resist. Some resisted anyway, though the resistance was mostly passive. A lot of people heckled the soldiers, threw rotten vegetables, or spit on them as they marched through. Others rearranged or removed road signs in an effort to confuse and delay the invading soldiers. Sometimes hilarity ensued, as in one case a Polish tank brigade drove around in circles for a day and a night before realizing that the road signs had been moved. In other cases, unfortunately, what ensued was tragedy rather than hilarity. Hundreds of civilians were injured in accidents as military vehicles crashed into civilian vehicles and pedestrians. Though there was little armed resistance, about 150 Czechoslovak civilians were killed and another 500 seriously wounded. In the aftermath of the invasion, Dubček was not arrested and executed as the Hungarian leader Imre Nagy had been 12 years earlier. He was instead brought to Moscow and forced to sign the humiliating Moscow Accords, which rolled back nearly all of his reforms and established a process of quote-unquote normalization, that is, the re-establishment of authoritarian one-party rule. Brezhnev realized, though, that Dubček was simply too popular to arrest or execute without further destabilizing the country. So he elected to humble him, restore him to his position, and bide his time until an opportune moment to remove him. That opportunity came in April 1969, spurred, as political change often is, by a hockey game. After the Czechoslovakian national hockey team defeated the Soviets in the 1969 Hockey World Championship, Czechoslovak fans took to the streets to celebrate. As they celebrated, many fans began to taunt the Soviet troops and chant various anti-Soviet slogans, including, quote, "No tanks were there, so they lost," end quote, and, quote, "Czechoslovakia 4, occupation 3, end quote. As the night went on, some of those celebrating fans turned violent, ransacking the Prague headquarters of Aeroflot, the Soviet state airline, and other symbols of the USSR in the capital. The police and military, now firmly restored to the control of pro-Soviet hardliners, proceeded to suppress the riots. And those hardliners in the Czechoslovak Politburo seized the moment to remove Dubček from his leadership post once and for all. He was quietly expelled from the Communist Party entirely the following year in 1970. But, unlike so many of the failed reformers and tragic figures we've discussed in this podcast, Dubček would be heard from again. During and after the Velvet Revolution of 1989, he would emerge as an important voice in Slovakia's transition away from communism. He was killed in a car crash on September 1st, 1992. Brezhnev's justifications for the invasion came to be known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. In a November 1968 speech to the Fifth Congress of the Polish Communist Party, Brezhnev stated of his doctrine, quote, "When forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of some socialist country towards capitalism, it becomes not only a problem of the country concerned, but a common problem and concern of all socialist countries," end quote. In other words, the Soviet Union reserved the right to use force to prevent any country in the communist world from straying away from the Soviet version of socialism. The Brezhnev Doctrine would remain an important tenet of Soviet foreign policy until it was renounced by Mikhail Gorbachev nearly 20 years later. After the invasion and Dubček's removal, Czechoslovakia reverted back to its pre-Dubček character, that of a repressive Eastern Bloc Soviet puppet state. If Brezhnev's goal in the invasion was to prevent the fracturing of the communist world, the move backfired spectacularly. Romania and Albania, both Warsaw Pact members, refused to support the invasion. Albania subsequently withdrew from the Warsaw Pact in September 1968. As they did not share a land border with the Soviet Union, Brezhnev could not simply invade to prevent their departure, and his circle of friends grew smaller by one. Communist China, whose relationship with the USSR was already strained for various reasons, was outraged by the invasion. The Chinese communists had little sympathy for Dubček or his liberal reforms. China was, if anything, even more of a hardline communist state than the Soviet Union. Their objection was to Soviet proclamations of hegemony, and their claim to the right of determining for other socialist countries what constitutes true socialism. Communist parties in the Western countries also splintered over the intervention. Where many Western communists had once seen themselves as separate arms in the same global movement as the Soviet Union, some of them now started to question whether this Soviet version of communism, which relied on violence to keep its allies in line, really aligned with their values after all. Some Western communists, who came to be known as tankies because of their rhetorical defense of the tanks rolling into Prague, continued to toe Moscow's party line. Other Western communists, however, broke from Moscow, choosing to pursue their own, more idealistic and democratic, in theory at least, versions of the communist ideology. If there is a single event that broke the power of communism as a unified global movement, it was the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And like Humpty Dumpty, once that shattered, it could not be put back together again. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I would like to give a big thank you and shout out to my patrons and supporters who support the show with monthly donations on Spotify and Patreon. If you're not a supporter yet and you want to be, links to my Spotify and Patreon pages can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to all of my streaming platforms and social media, and a list of my sources for this week's episode. The website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. If you can't afford to donate right now, you can also support the show by giving us a 5-star rating and subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. This engagement helps to promote the show in the algorithm and introduce us to new listeners. The most common way people learn about new podcasts is by word of mouth, so you can also support the show by telling your friends. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will discuss dissident movements and acts of rebellion in the Brezhnev-era Soviet Union. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.